if I look to the region from Brussels, if I look at it from Belgian Brussels, it's quite interesting. The largest ongoing Belgian combat operation in a long time, you could say, is taking part in the region. About 300 of our citizens are now foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq. It's not an officially condoned military operation, of course, but there it is. There is a precedent, however, people have forgotten that, but in the middle of the 19th century, about 1,000 or 1,500 Belgians also were inspired by their religious enthusiasm to go and fight for a foreign country. And not the religion, they went to fight for the Pope as volunteers to defend the worldly possessions of the Pope against what was then seen as the godless new kingdom of Italy. In spite of their valiant efforts, the Pope ended up with just the Vatican. But it was good occupation for lots of second sons of our nobility. At the same time, our caretaker government just decided that we will be part of the international coalition, and we have deployed 6 F-16 fighter aircraft to Iraq, which might now well bomb our own citizens then, which is an interesting proposition. Then just as in Libya 2011, it was a caretaker government that took this decision. Actually, when in the 1970s we bought the airplanes, that was a caretaker government too, which says you something about our country. Though the minister of the time, he was Paul van den Boeinans, and he was asked by a journalist, Monsieur le ministre, est-ce qu'un gouvernement en affaires courantes peut acheter des avions? And he said, Monsieur, vous savez très bien, ce ne sont pas des affaires courantes, ce sont des affaires volantes. And the decision was taken, and we bought 144 F-16s. To become a bit more serious, let me turn away from Belgian Brussels and turn to EU Brussels. And then I would say probably we have to learn three lessons for our engagement. One is that our neighborhood is bigger than we thought it was. Secondly, the comprehensive approach to the problems that we face in the neighborhood is more comprehensive than we thought of it. And thirdly, the real partners that we have in the neighborhood are, however, fewer than we thought they were. That would be my take on it. One, the neighborhood is bigger. I think the real neighborhood is bigger than the countries that are officially covered by the European neighborhood policy. By the real neighborhood, I mean that region in which events and developments have a rather direct impact on European interest. That is not just our immediate neighbors, but as people now like to call it, the neighbors of the neighbors. That actually includes the Sahel, that includes the Horn of Africa, and that includes the whole of the Gulf. And this means that we have to adapt our policy frameworks. My feeling is that we still, once in our policies we imagine a geographic divide and we draw a line in our policy frameworks between, the south of Algeria and Tunisia and Morocco, and after a while we begin to behave as if this line also exists in the real world. But of course, actual real-world developments don't take into account how the EU divides the world for its policy-making purposes. There are various answers possible. Should we extend the neighborhood policy itself to more countries? Perhaps, especially as I will argue later, that I think we need to start the neighborhood policy again from scratch anyway, as far as the South is concerned. I think we also have to be more flexible when it comes to the multilateral dimensions of our engagement with the region. The EU plus all of its immediate neighbors remains a useful framework, but for many other problems, it is not. If you want to talk about stabilizing the Sahel, you don't necessarily have to sit around the table with Turkey, Jordan, and so on, but you may want to sit around the table with Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Niger, Mali, etc. If you want to talk about the problem of the IS, you have to talk with countries that are beyond the neighborhood policy. You have to talk with Iraq, with Iran, with the Gulf states, etc. So we probably have to be a lot more flexible and create, I don't think we have to create a new plethora of institutionalized multilateral fora, but we have to probably initiate multilateral dialogues as and when we need them in an ad hoc. I think Europeans have to accept that from now on they will have to do their bit in dealing with the hard security problems of the region. We will have to deploy militarily also. We have done so. The intervention in Libya was initiated by Europeans, and it was very interesting that the French and the British had to convince the Americans of the necessity. Usually it's the other way around. The Americans try to convince us that we have to invade some place or other, but then we still needed massive American military support to be able to do this. Even French Air Force generals told me that 80 or 90% of the enabling capabilities were American, and if the French Air Force says it, it must be true. Then in Mali, France initiated the intervention, and I think that intervention already met much more how Americans would like to see things done. Europeans took the initiative, addressed the problem in a relatively early stage, quickly, without having to rely on many American military assets, except from intelligence mostly. And I'm definitely not saying that problem in Mali has been solved, but let's say it has been more or less kept under control now. And so I think here our role as Europeans has to change, because the American role is changing. Seen from the United States, I think there is only one strategic competitor, or potential strategic competitor to the US, and that is China. All other problems are distractions. And more they see them not as priorities, policy priorities in their own right. They see them as distractions that they have to deal with and will deal with. So the Americans are in the region still, and they are also dealing with the Ukraine crisis in our eastern neighborhood. But what they would really want to focus on, if they can, is China, and that's Asia and the Pacific. And the immediate expectation is that we Europeans, therefore, will shoulder a much bigger share of the burden also for the hard security problems than we've had in the past. And what they would really like to see, I think, is that we become the first-line responders when there are security problems. And it is Europeans who politically take the initiative whenever there is a problem, to assess it, to decide for ourselves which of our interests are at stake, what has to be done, and to forge the coalition that does it. Does it doesn't, of course, just mean military, mean diplomatic, economic, etc. That means that we Europeans have to really think now, for what do we feel responsible, and what are the implications for that, for the diplomatic, economic, and military means that we have to dedicate to this. Thirdly, partnership. Of course, the European Union likes to do everything with partners, but I have a feeling that we have taken this too far. I mean, I'm probably kicking an open door when I say that the basically paternalistic approach of the neighborhood policy no longer flies. If you behave well, you're rewarded by Auntie EU. It's just completely out of sync with the times, I think. Everybody's been talking about expansion of public space, how people in the region have become much more political actors. I don't imagine as anybody is waiting for the EU to come with the blueprint and say, now this is how you have to do things. It might have worked back in '95 had we implemented it from then on, as we said that we would, but we never did. And in the end, we never really implemented the neighborhood policy in the south as we said we would. But I think the problem goes even deeper. I've called this in a paper the sort of Snow White complex of the EU, where we want to be liked by everybody. We want to be pure and innocent and be everybody's friend. And just about half the world is the EU's partner. We have partnerships with just about everybody. Well, that's actually a fallacy. It's not true. You cannot say, I start diplomatic relations with someone and from day one we are partners. That's not how it works. Many of our so-called partners in the Middle East are not our partners at all, because we disagree fundamentally about values, about the objectives of foreign policy, and about the way of achieving those foreign policy objectives. And rather than stimulating change, because if you're already on the list of the partners, on the list of the good guys, why change? I think rather the EU itself has become tainted by partnering with all too many unsavory regimes. And I think what we see, therefore, is that if you read the rhetoric, if you look at the rhetoric, the EU's agenda has been a revolutionary agenda, to put it in political science terms. I don't think our friends in the External Action Service think of themselves as revolutionaries necessarily, but in political science terms, this idea that you could bring democracy and human rights and the rule of law and prosperity and security to the region basically means you want to change half of the regimes in the region. That is a revolutionary agenda. But in practice, the EU had very much become a status quo power in the region. And my conclusion is that we probably have to find a sort of middle way. A revolutionary agenda doesn't work. It was too ambitious, it was too over-optimistic. And I very much agree that from the outside, we have learned that we cannot engineer change. If change is happening, then you can hope to create a window of opportunity where you can have influence. But when change is not happening or supported internally, I think then to have a reforming influence from the outside is nearly impossible. We can probably aspire to a moderating influence, in the sense that you can try to curb excesses by exerting pressure in case of really seriously bad situations. But the purely status quo policy harms our interest also, because in many cases the status quo is bad. In many cases the status quo means that there are regimes in power that do not provide for their citizens, whereas the core idea of EU foreign policy is exactly that only where governments provide equally for all of their citizens in terms of their security, in terms of their human rights, in terms of their say in political decision making, and in terms of their prosperity, providing everybody with a fair share of the prosperity that their country produces. Only where governments do this can you have durable peace and stability. If the status quo means that you work with regimes who do not provide for their citizens, who only provide for themselves, those are inherently unstable and they will always cause problems. So a purely status quo policy has proved to be disastrous for our interests as well. So somehow we have to find a new middle way. Of course you could say, well, let's forget about the high-flown rhetoric then, and let's give up the ambition of promoting security, freedom and prosperity equally for all. That, I think, is impossible for an actor like the EU, because an actor like the EU, which is itself created on the basis of these values, has to be consistent with itself. No one would for a moment imagine that you would say, well, for the sake of expediency, we no longer take into account the rule of law or human rights when we implement a common agricultural policy. That would be unimaginable. It ought to be as unimaginable to say that we don't care about human rights in our foreign policy, because we are who we are. But we have to think of this as a much longer term goal and maybe become pragmatic idealists, saying, okay, we have our long-term goal, our long-term view remains that the best protection of our interests is the promotion of our values. And we have to stimulate governments outside the EU to take care of their citizens, like we try to take care of our citizens. And you have long-term policies for that, which I think are mostly economic in nature. And I would plead for the EU to use its means a lot more for economic investment that creates durable economic development. And then we have to be a lot more activist in actively seeking out opportunities. You know that as long as the status quo is there, a situation is frozen, then there is no chance of change. If change is happening, it means the situation can be unfrozen, and then things can improve, things will change for the better, but they can also change for the worse. And then I think we have to be a lot more proactive in assessing, okay, what is the cost-benefit analysis? If we intervene, is there a good chance that we can push change in the right direction, that things will change for the better, and what are the risks for us, and play a lot more active role. I think we did this in Libya. The assessment was that either we act now or the Gaddafi regime will win, and if we act now, we create an opportunity for change to happen. But then, of course, afterwards, I think Europeans completely dropped the ball, and there was little or no follow-up to this military intervention. My final sentence is that all of this really does require, I think, a bottom-up review of the neighbourhood policy for the South. So I would hope that the new High Representative, when Mogherini takes office, that this is one of the first tasks that she set. That we all accept that more for more is just more of the same, and that more of the same will not address the problems of the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sven.